Buying a home or place to live in Sweden is a very different process than what that process looks like in my home country where I was born and raised in the US. And having gone on a ton of apartment viewings over the last few months and even been considering buying a place to live for myself in Stockholm, I learned a lot about the home buying process. Just full disclosure, I ended up deciding to rent. So the current place that I am right now is a rental for various factors, which I might get into at the end of this video, why I thought renting was better for me right now. But I want to highlight some of the differences. So whether you're Swedish and you want to know how buying a home functions in the US, you might find this interesting. Or if you're a foreigner moving to Sweden interested in buying a property here, this video could be somewhat of a guide and at least warm you up so that you know what you should expect. Now, this first point applies specifically to apartments, not as often with homes. But for me, being in the center of Stockholm, most of the residences that I was looking at purchasing were apartments. And this is very, very interesting because when you buy an apartment in the US, it's pretty straightforward. You purchase the apartment and you own the apartment. Whereas in Sweden, in most cases, when you're buying an apartment, you're buying into a housing association and you're basically purchasing the right to live in the unit rather than actually purchasing the unit itself. This system is very unique to Sweden, and after speaking to several agents here, it was clear to me that Sweden is one of the only places in the world that has a system like this. It adds a whole nother dynamic to the property buying process because the association fees that you pay every month can be impacted by how good or bad the economic situation is for each förening. For example, a lot of förenings or home associations, they own the land that the building sits on, whereas some of them will rent them from the local commune. A lot of Swedes buying apartments in Stockholm, they want to buy into a property that is part of a good home association. So there's been times where I've seen a place and I really liked it and then realized that the förening's economy was not as good as I might have expected. And then it made me realize this is probably why there's not as many bidders going in for this property. In addition, housing associations will normally have rules on what the people living and are a part of this association can and can't do. And one way that these rules can come into play is they have the ultimate decision on if a landlord is allowed to rent out their apartment. Sweden has a lot of regulations on rental properties. And in the US, a lot of people will view properties as an investment where they'll buy a property and then rent it out and get the recurring residual income from a property that they own. In Sweden, there are a ton of regulations around this, and most associations want the person that owns the apartment to be living in it. And oftentimes they'll make exceptions if someone is going to go study in another town or has a job abroad that they want to go try out, or if they want to test live with a romantic partner. Most housing associations will let you rent your place out if it's short term. But if you want to do this for the long term, they'll ask you to sell your place because from what I've picked up, a lot of the housing associations are against having long-term renters here, which is completely different than the system in the United States. Another thing that's really good to know when it comes to buying a property in Sweden is that it's typical to put 15% down as a payment towards your property when you're buying something here. And in the US, this can oftentimes be much lower. For example, my little brother and his girlfriend in the US are considering buying a property in around the same price range as me, actually. However, in their situation, they needed to come up with 5%. In my situation, I need to put 15% down in Sweden. So needless to say, they needed a lot less upfront cash to buy the property than what is typical for people to buy a property in Sweden. Another thing to consider is that in the US, the most common type of mortgage by far is a 30-year fixed mortgage, which means when you buy a property, you make the same monthly payment for 30 years until your property is fully paid off. Now, if interest rates in the US drop in the future, you can actually refinance your mortgage. So a bank will buy out your old mortgage and then you can get a new mortgage with them at a lower rate and you can lock in a lower payment for the duration or the rest of your mortgage. In Sweden, long-term fixed rate mortgages are super uncommon. In fact, I've never heard of them. The longest that I've really seen here in Sweden is 3 years. So you commit to making a payment for 3 years, and then your monthly payments will adjust after 3 years, depending on the current interest rates. So we've seen recently in Sweden, with interest rates rising across the globe, many people that own their properties here had much larger monthly payments, because oftentimes their interest rates would go from maybe 1 to 2% to 4 to 5% when it changed after 3 years. And in my personal situation, after looking at the current interest rates in Sweden and seeing what my payments would be every month to buy a place, it just made more sense for me to go ahead and rent, because I was actually going to save $500 or $600 a month by renting rather than buying a similar place of my own. Another interesting aspect of buying a property in Sweden is that the real estate agents in Sweden are obligated to represent both sides or both parties in the transaction. So by law, they need to safeguard and represent the best for both the buyer and the seller. Whereas in the US, you have a buyer's agent, which is representing the buyer, and a seller's agent that is representing the seller. I found this very unique, and I think it also goes to show that Swedish people are very trusting, and the real estate profession in general in Sweden, people are dependent on the agents to be clear and straightforward and have the best interest of everyone at heart. It's also worth mentioning that to become a real estate agent in Sweden, it's a normal college course of study that I think takes 3 years, whereas in the US, in most states, you could get a real estate license after studying for a few months. So the process of becoming a real estate agent in Sweden is a longer and more rigorous one compared to what we have in the States. When it comes to the actual properties themselves, Stockholm is a very unique market, and for me personally, I really highly value living in the center part of Stockholm, which is very expensive if you look at the price per square meter. Of course, we're dealing with square meters in Sweden, where we have square feet in the US, and the conversion, although it's not exactly, is roughly about 10 square feet for every 1 square meter. And for me, living in Stockholm, I've typically lived in places between 30 and 40 square meters, so 300 to 400 square feet, which for just me is perfect. Now, if you're living in a very compact and expensive city in the US, like San Francisco or New York, you can probably find places this small as well. However, in the area where I grew up, it was a suburb, and most people were looking at full homes that might be 2,000 square feet. But of course, when you go outside of Stockholm, you can find homes which are much bigger. I kind of like to think of Stockholm as sort of like a mini New York. It's very compact, you can walk everywhere, there's a ton of fun things to do, but what you're paying for the amount of size you get, again, is quite a lot. So when you're buying a place, it just comes down to what you value. If you want more space, it might be worth looking a little bit outside of a major city. Whereas for me, I love being able to walk everywhere, to work, to my gym, and to all the social activities that I have going on in my life. If you want to see for yourself what properties are like in Sweden, the most common website that I would go to research what properties look like is hemnet.se, and here you can type in a city or whatever and actually go in and look at the properties. In the US, we have Zillow, and that's basically the American equivalent of Hemnet. So what should you do in Sweden if you find a place that you like and you want to buy it? The first thing that you need to do in order to get approved to leave bids on an apartment is to get a loan promise or lånelöfte from a bank. And I pretty much filled mine out online and got an answer in basically a day of the max bid that I could be able to leave on an apartment. I've heard some people actually physically going into a bank, but mine worked super simple online, basically filling in questions of how much I make, what loans I have, and the whole process was super straightforward. They'll do a little background check, and then you'll get an answer from a bank. Then you're welcome to go to different apartment viewings around town, and you can have an ongoing dialogue with the real estate agent how much you'd be willing to bid on a property. And for me, that's pretty much as far as I got before deciding to rent. But if you do go all the way and buy a place for yourself, then the agent will help you through the process, you'll make the down payment, and you'll get the title transferred to your name when you eventually buy something. So guys, I hope you found this one interesting, and as always, if you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave them down below. I'd love to see what you guys have to think about this. That being said, I'll see you in another video.